Investigation. Let's go right to CNN's Evan Perez and Pamela Brown. Pam, what have you learned?
Anderson, we've learned that a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. on Friday approved the first charges in the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller. This is according to sources briefed on the matter. The charges are still sealed under orders from a federal judge at this hours. And Anderson, we're told that plans were prepared Friday for anyone charged to be taken into custody possibly as soon as Monday, these sources said. It's unclear exactly what these charges are against the indictment. The indictment is under seal. A spokesman for the special counsel's office declined to comment on this story. And as you know, Anderson, Mueller was appointed in May to lead the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. elections. And he was given broad authority under the mandate given to him by Rod Rosenstein. So this is a significant development in the investigation. Top lawyers who are helping to lead the Mueller firm, the probe, we should say, including veteran prosecutor Andrew Wiseman, were seen today entering the courtroom at the D.C. federal court where the grand jury meets to hear testimony in the Russia investigation. And reporters present saw a flurry of activity at the grand jury room, but officials made no announcement. But we are learning today, Anderson, that the grand jury approved the first charges in the Mueller investigation.
So just to be clear, Pam, we don't know what the charges are at this point, and we don't know who has been charged.
That's correct. We have ideas of who has been charged, but we are not naming those people. We don't believe that they have actually been notified yet. Typically what happens is the grand jury will approve an indictment. It'll stay under seal, and then they will go through a certain process that takes a few days or a couple of days to get the arrest warrant and so forth before perhaps the attorney is called asking for that person, for the attorney to have their clients turn themselves in. So we believe that may be at play because we are told, again, as early as Monday, possibly Monday or perhaps beyond, that is when we may see some law enforcement activity related to these indictments under seal, Anderson.
Evan, can you say or do we know if it's more than one person?
Well, Anderson, we believe it's more than one person, but again, they have not been notified, and that's one of the things we were trying to do today. We were working on this story for several hours as we were trying to contact some of the lawyers of the people involved. Some of them did not get back to us, so we'll be continuing to work on that over the weekend. Okay. But, you know, it is something that obviously, because it's under seal, it's actually one of the more difficult parts of this story to cover.
So, Evan, to bring charges like this, who would have to approve them?
Well, Rod Rosenstein is the Attorney General here who's handling this, who's overseeing this investigation. He's the Deputy Attorney General, but for this case, because the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, is recused, he is acting as the Attorney General, and so he oversees this, and he has the right to review the charges, and if he thinks that they're not appropriate, he can tell Robert Mueller that he doesn't approve them. He can reject them. So at this stage, Anderson, we don't know exactly what interaction there was, but we do believe that given the regulations that govern what Mueller is doing, that he would have had to give Rod Rosenstein notice about this and at least, you know, told him what he was preparing to do and given Rosenstein the chance to say you can't do this if he believed it was not appropriate.
Would that information be given to the White House as well, or be given to Attorney General Jeff Sessions since he had recused himself?
No, not under this circumstance. Under this circumstance, it would be something that that Rosenstein, who is, you know, for all intents and purposes, the Attorney General for this case, he is the one, the ultimate authority to oversee this, and it would not, under these circumstances, be notified to the White House, simply because, Anderson, this is a case that involves so many people at the White House, of course, including the President.
So, Pam, how significant, I mean, let's put this in perspective, and again, we don't know what the charges are or who has been charged or haven't confirmed it or we're not saying it. How significant a development is this in the Russia investigation?
It's a landmark development. I mean, this is what, in a sense, we've been waiting to see if this will happen, if Robert Mueller's team will bring any indictments related to the Russia probe. This is an investigation that's been going on for well over a year. It started in the 2016 campaign. The FBI opened it. And then, as you know, Robert Mueller took over in May. And it had groups of investigators looking at possible collusion, looking at Paul Manafort, the former campaign chairman, Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, and also looking at obstruction of justice with the president's firing of James Comey and the circumstances surrounding that. And so this is certainly a big significant step and an acceleration, an indication that the investigation has accelerated to a point where they believe they have the case. It's probable cause. You have to show probable cause when you go before a grand jury. So they believe they have enough to at least show probable cause for at least one person who has been under investigation in this probe. And we should also mention that it will be interesting to see what the charges are, because if they have nothing to do with the campaign or Russia, you can expect Mueller's shop to draw a lot of heat, especially from the White House. You heard the president say that this is a waste of taxpayer dollars. And so if this has nothing to do with that, that will be really, really interesting to see. But Mueller has broad authority under the regulations to investigate anything that may arise from the Russia probe. Anderson.
Evan, do you have a sense what the process for this is? You said, arrests could be made Monday or Tuesday or in that time frame.
Right.
But in terms of what the charges are, is that announced at some point? Does the Department of Justice announce who is going to be arrested, or only after they've been arrested?
Well, our understanding, Anderson, is that that is the plan, is that once these people have been arrested, then the special counsel would make a public announcement about what these charges are and the people who are affected. Again, part of the issue here is making sure you know where these people are, making sure that you contact the lawyers. I mean, in this case, they would probably call the lawyers perhaps on Sunday or Monday and tell them you have until a certain hour to have your client turn themselves in. And obviously, if they don't do that, then the U.S. Marshals and the FBI would try to figure out how to bring them under arrest, and then the procedure would be then to bring them to court here in D.C. in Washington, and then take them to get the charges read to them for the first time in federal court. And I just want to add real quick to what Pamela was just saying. I mean, one of the things, and look, this is not, I don't think this is affecting how Robert Mueller is handling this case, but you got to think, right? If you're running an investigation like this and you're starting to hear Republicans are now starting to say that the time is ticking away and that it's time to try to end this, and you hear the president now sending out tweets about the costliness of this investigation. Look, they do have to do something to show what it is they're coming up with, and I think that's partly what's happening here, is that I think they believe that they have enough evidence to be able to bring charges against at least a couple of individuals, or at least one individual here in this case, and that's what's happening here, Anderson.
Evan Perez, Pamela Brown, appreciate it. I know you're continuing to work your sources. I want to bring in the panel. Carl Burr.
We begin with that breaking news. CNN reporting that according to two sources briefed on the matter, the first charges have been filed in the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller. The charges are apparently still sealed under orders from a federal judge, so we don't know who the charges are against, and we don't even know what the charges are. NBC News has not yet confirmed this report, and no other news organization has confirmed it yet either, so we can only go by what CNN is saying at the moment. But according to their sources, a federal grand jury in D.C. today approved the first charges in Mueller's investigation. And joining us now are Ron Klain, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. He's also a former chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee and was chief of staff to Attorney General Janet Reno. Also David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones and an MSNBC political analyst, and Natasha Bertrand, political correspondent at Business Insider, and she's been closely following Russia's involvement in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Thank you all. So I'm going to go around. I'm going to start with you, Natasha, just to get sort of your top line on what we're hearing now. And you know, what I was talking to Rachel about a little bit, does it feel like this might be, rather than the beginning of a story, maybe sort of the kind of crest of a story that began like 48 hours ago or so when we started to hear this alternate collusion theory?
Absolutely. I mean, this kind of puts into context all of the distractions that we've been getting out of the, Republicans over the last week, and aided by the president this morning when he tweeted that now we know that there is no collusion between Donald Trump and Russia. It was all Hillary Clinton. The uranium story that mysteriously appeared after 7 years in the Hill last week. This was all very much foreshadowing something big to come. And, the fact that, the report that Mueller has filed these charges is an indication that he is moving very quickly to perhaps get someone to flip in the investigation, because prosecutors don't normally do charges this early in an investigation. So this is definitely something that's big.
And it's moving pretty quickly. And Ron Klain, the idea here is that this, if this investigation is sort of wrapping up, it does impact in some way the investigations that are going on in the House and particularly in the Senate, where they seem to be a bit more serious, at least on the Senate intelligence side, about doing it. What do you expect to be staffers to be talking about tonight on that Senate side, thinking about their own investigations?
Yeah, I think staffers and everyone is just saying who. I mean, I think that this is going to be an amazingly suspenseful weekend as we wait and see who winds up being taken into custody on Monday or Tuesday of next week as a result of this indictment. I think there's some possibility that it is just low-level people, that Mueller is working his way up the food chain and trying to get people to flip. But it's also possible that we're going to see the first indictment of one of the more headline names in this case, people against whom the evidence has piled up mightily, and it's time for Mueller to finally move. So I think it's going to be 48 hours of huge speculation in Washington as we wait and see really who's going to wind up being this first person or persons indicted by Counsel Mueller.
Yeah, well, let's do some informed speculation here with David Corn. David, you got some great sources. You were among the first to report on that dossier that Republicans tried to hang around Hillary Clinton as if, who paid for it was really the important thing. Give us a little bit of a benefit of what you're hearing or what people are speculating about. Who, as Ron Klain just said.
Well, I think it would be a little bit unfair to start speculating on names. We do know it's been reported that the special counsel told Paul Manafort that he could expect to be indicted. And it's also important to know that the special counsel is really been given the purview to examine any issue that arises in the investigation. And we do know that in the course of investigating the Trump-Russia scandal, the special counsel had reason to look at lobbying activities by Paul Manafort, maybe some financial transactions. Of course, what Rachel was talking about earlier, activities involving Michael Flynn that may not be related to Russia, but may still be improper, if not illegal. So there's just a lot to choose from for those who care to speculate. But I also would say that after this week of distraction about Hillary, going back and looking at Hillary Clinton's uranium deal, which wasn't her deal, going back and looking at how James Comey dealt with the Clinton email server controversy, that really nothing cuts through distractions like indictments. I mean, whatever's going on in the House Intelligence Committee, it looks a little bit like a circus. I reported last week that they barely have enough staff to do anything that they say they're doing, and who knows what's happening in the Senate Intelligence Committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee is blown up. Indictments will concentrate the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And Natasha, I think David makes a really important point here, because I think that for a lot of people who are watching this whole thing that we sometimes call Russiagate or the Russia collusion story, the collusion is sort of the sexy thing that people talk about. But what we've been, the actual components of this investigation have involved a lot more sort of straightforward potential criminal activity, things like Foreign Agent Registration Act violations, things like potential money laundering, the sort of potential things that this could be. We shouldn't necessarily be looking for this to be a conclusion or an indictment that has the word collusion somewhere in it.
No, not necessarily. And again, Mueller's his mandate is very broad.
Right.
So whatever he comes across over the course of his investigation that's even remotely related to Russia or anything that might have had to, Russian funding, et cetera, Mueller will have to investigate, and he could use that as leverage to get people like Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn to flip and to tell him what happened during the 2016 election, because they really had a direct window into all of the questions that Mueller now wants to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ron Klain, Ben Wittes, who has become very famous for his tick, tick, tick tweets and ticks and booms and things. Sean Hannity tried to steal them, but didn't do very well with it. This is some of what he's been saying tonight. He said this is a very big boom if true, but the story is very skeletal, both in content and sources. Another note here, that just noting the sourcing on the CNN story, which is sources briefed on the matter. And he says, I can't think of very many classes of people who would be briefed on the matter. What classes of people might be briefed on something such as this?
Well, they could be people who are lawyers or friends or family members potentially of the people who are about to be taken into custody. The indictment could be sealed because the person who's been indicted has been offered a chance to turn themselves in, and could be people involved in the arrangements for turning themselves in, people potentially at a courthouse or whatnot. So it's a pretty small group. I share David's view that it's a little bit irresponsible to speculate about exactly who this would be, but there's no question that if CNN is right, and if an indictment has been filed today, and if someone is going to either be arrested or turn themselves in on Monday or Tuesday, there would be a number of people who would be briefed on the logistics and the mechanics of doing that, and it's possible one of those people told CNN.
And to stay with you just for a moment, Ron Klain, if you could just talk a little bit about, because that is an important point, and it also could be somebody that Mueller is attempting to utilize in his investigation to sort of go further up the food chain, right? So the process of this may not be sort of the spectacular scene that people think, they think of sort of in a TV episode of Law and Order, right?
No, probably not. But I do think, I do think that this is also not the culmination. This is definitely not the end of it. I agree absolutely with your point a minute ago, Joy, that if people are waiting for the final scene of this collusion drama, that's not what we're getting at this stage in time. We're probably going to get either one of these individuals who is guilty of a series of other crimes, failing to file financial disclosures, taking foreign money from foreign sources without disclosing that, or someone who has some piece of information, some lower point on the totem pole that Mueller is going to work his way up to. So I think we've got to get our expectations for this set in the right place for what's going to happen early next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, the other thing I was talking with Rachel about is this sort of notion that you've had certain people on Capitol Hill, obviously Devin Nunes is the most high profile of them, that seems to have been escalating their attempts to sort of protect and quarantine the White House by engaging in these alternate universe versions of the Russia scandal. Do you think it is fair to sort of draw a line between what you've seen on Capitol Hill, you're there in Washington, and the idea that something like this is coming and maybe sources were being briefed on it?
It's a good theory. I'm not sure it's true, but the timing certainly is highly coincidental, because this past week we saw indeed an intensification on the Republican side with them bringing up these issues of how the dossier was funded, whether the uranium deal was somehow connected to Clinton pay-to-play. The answer is no. You bringing back the whole Jim Comey thing. I'm expecting them to go back to unmasking. Remember, that was one of the counter areas. And the thing, to take a step back, because we can look at this in a very partisan way and say, look, it's obviously trying to deflect from the core of the issue here, which is what the Russians did and how Trump covered for that, whether he interacted with it directly. The United States was attacked. The United States was attacked by a foreign adversary. Its political system was subverted, was undermined. We can always argue about what the impact was and whether it was successful and whether it influenced the election or not. And yet the Republicans, who have always claimed to be more patriotic than anyone else, claim to support the intelligence community, are now dissing the intelligence community and really doing nothing to deal with what happened in the past or what might happen in the future. And that, to me, is somewhat, I have to say that, somewhat surprising.
Yeah, and and I think, Natasha, it's important. I mean, this is the things that you've been working on this week. I mean, also before this big news or potential news broke tonight, you had the news that Ms. Veselnitskaya, the attorney who met with Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort and Jared Kushner at Trump Tower, was directly connected, or at least using talking points that had been shared with Kremlin sources. We had your reporting on the connections between the data firm that was run by Paul Manafort, that was run by Steve Bannon, and this potential sort of outreach to WikiLeaks. So, I mean, I think for a lot of people it becomes very confusing, right? This sort of Russia scandal is so far-reaching. Do you think that there was any news, particularly this week, that broke through as something that might actually help us get to the answer as to why?
Well, I think that the most consequential news, if confirmed, is definitely the Mueller charges. That just signals a complete escalation of it all. But also the news that Cambridge Analytica reached out to Julian Assange during the campaign. That is a really big indication that, and it's the first time that we've seen that an entity that was working directly with the Trump campaign was reaching out to Julian Assange and trying to get Hillary Clinton's emails from an entity that the U.S. intelligence community has concluded as a foreign intelligence agent, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's important to point out that when they they did that in July, there already was a pretty strong public record that the Russians were behind the stealing of the DNC emails and other materials. So they literally were saying, we're going to get into bed with someone who's probably working with the Russians in order to advance our political campaign. You can only imagine what would have happened if Obama or Clinton had been caught doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, we can only imagine, Ron Klain, what Donald Trump is going to say or do, or how he might react this weekend. I don't know. Speculate for us. What do you think? What would you anticipate? I'm sure more tweets.
More tweets. But I think this could be getting serious enough that we might turn on Fox and find the Yule log and classical music playing. I mean, I don't know how they're going to possibly deal with the fact that the week-long attack they've made on this uranium thing that the U.S. government did, that they've tried to turn into the Clintons being Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, that all this craziness about who paid for the so-called Steele dossier and all these things, they have been at full alert over there, DEFCON 1 all week long on all these so-called Clinton scandals, and the fact that we are facing potentially the first indictments of people involved in this Russia scandal, maybe peripherally involved, maybe involved on other issues, that is going to be a real collapse in the narrative that they are very heavily invested in over there.
Hey there, I'm Chris.